So, John, thank you very much for this for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm pretty sure everybody will be thrilled to hear about the stuff you do because it's not very common at all to have people with like first-hand knowledge on flea napping, first-hand knowledge on hunting and things like this. So, I think it would be really nice for our audience, both students and professionals, to hear about your work. And I would like to say that you will be here in Brazil soon, so people we can interact with you personally and ask you more questions. But I think this is a good way to introduce you to people, and so they will know you better later. And I would like to for you to talk about your background, how you were involved in archaeology, and the path that led you
Okay.
to this venue.
That's it's a long path and it's still continuing. But first off, thank you for inviting me down. I can't wait. This could be my first trip really south of the border. As you know, and we'll talk about, I do a lot of stuff over in Europe, but this will be my first time, so I'm really excited. But how this all started, to just give you a little bit of background, I'm retired from the United States military. I was in the military for 24 years. I grew up in eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, so out on the high plains. And it all started out there. My mother, of course, kept like report cards from when I was little. And it's funny because I went back and I've looked at them. And in these report cards, every one of them says, they called me Johnny back then, but Johnny really enjoyed and became very active when we started discussing the Native American culture. And then I open up the next one. It says Johnny got very excited and was very participative in it. So I don't know why this started. I mean, I guess I should get this out of the way real quick. I do have a tiny bit of Native heritage, but I didn't even know about it for a long time. So I don't know what kind of drew that into me. But then when we were living out in Nebraska, when we first moved out there, people would talk to me about, they hear how much I like the Indian stuff, and they're like, or Native American stuff, and they're like, well, you can find arrowheads. And I'm like, I don't know what those things are, but I got to find one. And every place we'd go, my father had his own shop for a while. He's a brilliant welder, and he can fix anything. But we also raised quarter horses because I showed horses for quite a while and was around horses a lot and cattle. But every place we'd go, I'd always ask them, hey, do you ever find arrowheads? And they're like, yeah, over there on that hill. And Dad would look at me and say, you got 1 hour. I didn't know. I mean, unless it was an arrowhead, perfect arrowhead, I wouldn't have known. But I guess I don't know. My mother would probably disagree because of the washing machine. I picked up all the stuff because out where I grew up on the high plains, we have some lithic sources, but they're usually way spread out, or we have down the waterways and stuff, we'll get petrified woods and stuff that could work. So we don't have huge lithic scatters or debitage fields like you do in some places. So I would bring everything that I found, and that way the next time I went out, I didn't have to look at the same thing again either. Well, as I started to learn, because you got to remember, this was, 1970s, so there's no internet. The little town that we were living in at the time was 200 people. So we had a library and a school, and I can remember, in fact, I bought a copy of it just so I'd have it. Time Life did a series on early man. And inside there, Professor Francois Bordes was in there, and he's flint napping. I'd just stare at those pages. I'd look at all the stone tools all the time because that's all I had. And I would ask tons and tons and tons of questions. And of course, I got some pretty great answers now that I look back, and I think they're pretty funny. If you grab it this way, this is the way that, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm gullible. I'll believe it. But from when I did find my first arrowhead, and I mean, this is actually kind of funny. This is a little tiny frame of some of the first projectile points I ever found as a child.
Wow. Nice.
I've got some more, but I mean, those are just some that I've got set off to the side. But once I found my first one, then it just exploded. I wanted to know who, what, why, where, how. And I knew that it just wasn't just an arrowhead. Well, how are they used? Bows and arrows. Okay, then I started trying to make bows, which was very much a failure most of the time because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have anyone to show me. And I was trying to make arrowheads and had no idea what to do. All I could do, I could see that the rocks were broken. So I would just bash on rocks. And in fact, it was funny, during my retirement ceremony, the colonel that retired me called my father and asked my father, he says, tell me some memory that you have of John. He said, well, we never had to look for the kid. All you had to do was follow the sound of banging rocks. So that's kind of where it all started. And luckily, out where I grew up, there are some fantastic collections. And being a rancher and being around that stuff, they were always very willing to share. So I've got to handle and see some of the best collections of Indian, Paleo-American artifacts in the world. And that started from when I was little. So even though I didn't completely understand it, I just knew that it was something I wanted to know more and more about, because we just see one little tiny piece of materiality when it comes to our prehistoric ancestors. So what's all the stuff that propelled all this? I mean, literally, what propelled all this? What did their bows look like? What did their arrows look like? Why did they pick a bow like that was short? Is it sinew backed? Does it, how does it work? And I think that's what kind of drove it. It wasn't just finding them. I mean, I know a lot of people that collect them and find them and they're like, oh, this is really cool. I found a new one. Put it in the catalog. When I pick up something like a freaking blade core like this and I look at it, it tells me a story. But all those early years of that development, I've always kind of paid attention to that stuff. So then keep fast forwarding a little bit. I'm a teenager. All I ever wanted to do was be an archaeologist. That's all I ever wanted to do. But growing up on a ranch with a very practical father, and I honestly, now looking back at it, I understand 100% why he was like this. He tried to do everything he could to dissuade me from becoming an archaeologist. And I think the main reason was in the 70s, 80s, archaeology doesn't pay great now. It sure didn't pay great back then. So I think he knew that. So then it was like, well, what are you going to do? I graduated with one of the largest classes in my high school history, which was consolidated. So you had other towns coming together, and we had like 45 people. But so then I panicked. I'm like, what am I going to do? I come from a fairly big military family. Dad was in the Seabees. My grandfather was in the Marine Corps for over 30 years. Uncle that retired from the Army. No one ever talked about the military to me really at all. So I went off and I got an equally horrible paying job, and I got a degree in radio and television broadcasting. So I worked in radio for a while. And I was playing in heavy metal bands because, I knew I was going to be a rock star one day. So, it was cool. Well, one day I woke up and I guess a patriotic bone ignited or something. And I decided I was going to join the military. I didn't tell my parents because I went to school for 2 years, had an associate's degree, came back. And we were in another part of Eastern Colorado. I was still looking for arrowheads, still trying to figure it out because I still didn't have anybody to show me, no books. Because, that was, that's the 80s. The internet doesn't come out until, 91. So, I would just try to pick up tidbits from people. I talked to one person and said, yeah, I saw this guy with a nail chipping pieces off. I'm like, chipping pieces off? Oh, I should rewind. I had a 6th grade teacher. He was the only male teacher in our elementary school. But he took some archaeology classes, and of course, I was arrowheads. And finally, it's like, do you want to see how one gets made? And I'm like, yes. So luckily, in that little tiny town of 200 people, there was a blacksmith, but he was a big rock collector. And him and his wife loved kids, and I went over and he gave me a big piece of obsidian. So I took it in. Somebody brought in a deer antler, which was just all chalky and white. They'd been sitting out forever. But Mr. Anderson, that was his name, he took and he hit it, knocked a piece of a little flake of obsidian off, crunched some notches in it, sharpened it up, and I was like, what is that? I've got to do this. And that kind of kept pushing it. So now I'm seeing different ways to do this. Well, I joined the military. My love for the stuff has never stopped. So I get stationed in Germany at first. It was West Germany at that time. I was 87. Then I got stationed in Texas. And I went out to a little rock shop and I asked them, I wanted to get some obsidian. And at that time I was using all antler, stuff like that, because I didn't know there was anything different. I met some people here. They introduced me to some people and they're like, hey, have you tried copper? And I'm like, what, am I putting pipes in the house? And it's like, no. And then they showed me and I'm like, oh my God, that makes it so much easier. So then I just kept going. And I mean, to make a long story short, when it comes to the napping part, I luckily fell in with some very, very talented flint nappers who kind of took me under their wing. No one ever really said, here, do it this way. A lot of times it was just suggestive. So a lot of observational learning on my part. When the knowledge was already there, the know-how was still in the building phase. And I mean, with flint napping, the knowledge, the know-how part will go on forever. I mean, I've been flint napping now for, it's well over 30 years, and I feel like I just scratched the surface. But so then it came to other things. When I was stationed in Maryland, back in Washington, D.C. area, I got involved with a little park. That park had a primitive technologies club, which that's a word we'll discuss a little bit later on. I hate the word primitive technologies when it's involved with early cultural or ancestral lifeways, because there's nothing primitive about it. These guys were the cutting edge of technology. We would have nothing. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for their technology. So although it may seem simple, it's very advanced, I believe. But so I learned how to make cordage. I learned how to do all these other things. And it just kept going because I wanted to know, why. I need to know, I still need these answers. So it is about that same time I joined the Maryland Arqueological Society, and they had a field school. Well, at this point in time, I had never taken an archaeology class. I had never been on an excavation. I'd never seen this, but I knew what to do. And I knew to be careful and slow and meticulous, because it's like, picking up a book and ripping a page out, as you well know. I mean, so that data, we only get to look at that one little snapshot in time once, and then we move it and it's gone. So I knew this, and I was really, really careful with the way I did things. And they noticed this because, the Maryland Archaeological Society is part of the state. Each county here has its own, archaeological, or a district has a district archaeologist. Well, the people who actually were excavating the site were part of, and this is a mouthful, the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission. They fell under that. Well, they came up to me before the field school was done, and they're like, we would like for you to continue to come out and work with us. And it was close to the base where I was stationed, so on the weekends I'd go out and I'd work with them. At the time, they were getting all their funding for the colonial aspect of the site, because this was a site called Mount Calvert that was the first county seat of Prince George's County in Maryland in 1620. But it was over the top of all the way down to middle, early archaic Native American stuff. So they're like, would you take over all the Native American stuff? And I'm like, yes. So, I did all the lab stuff. Yeah. Okay, if you're going to twist my arm, just please get your historic overburden off of my stuff, please. So that kind of started me down my archaeology path, to the point where I would come out and I would do flint knapping demonstrations. I'd get out an atlatl and let the kids play with it, bows, all that stuff, just to kind of work with school groups and other groups that they had coming out, just to kind of show them what they're seeing here, to kind of put the two together. Because I think a lot of times we're really good at presenting objects, but a lot of times their biography of that object, I don't think is really fully conveyed to the people who are seeing it. I mean, once you see an arrowhead, you're like, okay, it's an arrowhead. Then you show it on an arrow. It's like, oh, it goes with this. And then you show it with the system, which that'll all draw into when we start talking a little bit about hunting, why you make things the way you do, form, function, and that thing. So that just, continued on to the point where we're really skipping up through history now. I kept doing that, was engaged with that. I did some work with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey when I was stationed in North Texas. In fact, they actually had an archaeologist certification program under the Oklahoma Archaeological Society. So I was doing some things like that, although that was quite a drive for me as well. But still, it was something that I really wanted to do. So I kept doing that. And all the time, I'm still flint knapping. Although I will say a lot of my probably 10, 11 years ago, I would say it was more commercially driven. So I was using a lot more, modern tools. And, anybody, I'll probably step on some toes here, but I was one of the same people that said, you can do this the same with antler or with bone or whatever as you do with copper. Yeah, it's kind of the same, but it's not the same. It's so much different, the edge preparation, all these different things. But that's the continual growing cycle. But then I start moving and going over to Europe a lot. I got invited over to Norway by a Norwegian colleague of mine. Actually, he's like family now. Morten Kuchera, his brother Aspen, they're twins and they're both archaeologists. How fun is that? And I mean, they're identical twins too. It's funny. But so all of a sudden, I'm retired. I became very unexpectedly single at the same time I retired. So now it's like, okay, what do I want to do? Everything kind of started pulling me back towards archaeology. So over in Norway, then I'm over in Denmark working at with Morten at a place called Tabula, which is like one of the huge places. It's actually, there's a whole culture named after that site, the Tabula culture, which is Mesolithic. So working with them there, and then we go up to Lejre, which is a very famous place in Denmark, is a big experimental archaeology place. And we're up there for the weekend, and here's all these students from the University of Exeter. And at that time, Bruce was there, but he didn't come over to Denmark. But so I'm there, and I met who would be my mentor through my time at the university there, Dr. Linda Hercom, who really opened my eyes to one of the main things I would say that I really owe her on was she wrote a book called The Missing Majority, which basically talks about perishables, the stuff that we never get to see. So I'm working with some of her students. They're asking me how to do this, that, and the other. And it's like, oh, okay, that's cool. Well, which included a couple from Brazil as well. But then it was like, okay, that was fun. Still kind of getting back into the archaeology thing. Well, then all of a sudden it's like, somebody asked me, I said, you earned educational benefits through the military, didn't you? And I'm like, yeah, I did. They said, you ever thought about going to the University of Exeter? And I'm like, I don't have a bachelor's. I've got, 3 associate's degrees. And I was like, let me call Linda. So Linda, Dr. Hercom, and I had a conversation. And when I told her, she's like, oh God, yes, please come. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, let's slow down. So I submitted all my stuff, because over there, and maybe even in Brazil too, something they don't do a lot of here in the US is practical knowledge and practical application. If that was your vocation, they'll look at that and say, you don't need this. If you've got the academics, we'll let you go past this level, the undergraduate level. So Linda's like, we know who you are. We know people. It's easy to find you in the World Wide Web community with this. So that's not a problem. I sent in my academics. I said, that's not a problem. I had to work with the Veterans Administration here for them to approve it, but they approved it. So I moved to England in 2019 and did my master's in experimental archaeology at the University of Exeter. So now I'm both feet back into it. So that was kind of the from I was born, I've living, and this is where I'm at, so that's that kind of gives you the background. But the funny thing is, I guess to kind of put a cap on this, is my love for this stuff has just never waned. It's only grown. Wow. My questions have only gotten more involved. Great. So I will never, ever, ever, I need like 3 lifetimes to explore everything that I need to explore. And then I still won't have any answers, but that's what makes this stuff so exciting, is that all we can do is look at possibilities and probabilities, and then look at the outcomes with good experimentation and what we see in the archaeological record and say, this is possibly what they were doing, or this was probably what they're doing. And if somebody ever invents a time machine, there's going to be a lot of screwed up theories. That's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. So this leads us to your second question. Like you were mentioning all the...
What, that was just the first one? No,
yeah. Well, part of the other questions were answered with your first. Can you tell people what is experimental archaeology and what is the importance of this field of study in archaeology as a whole?
That's a very good question. First off, I will say that properly conducted experimental archaeology is vital for our continued understanding of our prehistoric past. And I always say, I don't care where in the planet you are, we're all connected. And it's our collective prehistoric past. So some of the earliest evidence of experimental archaeology, it was more experiential, but it was still kind of experimental. Because first off, I guess we should put that out there. Experimental archaeology is actual science-based experimentation. You have to have a research question. You have to list all your variables. You have to, if you're using different types of materials, all this stuff has to be put in there within a parameter of a research question. So looking at that, that's true experimental. You see a lot of people post on the internet anymore, or Facebook or Instagram, any of those, and they're like, hashtag experimental archaeology. I'm doing experimental archaeology, when it's like you're trying out a new tool. It's experiential. You're trying to get experience with something new. That's what that is. Experimental archaeology has criteria just like science, because the only way that we can get it accepted as a science is to follow scientific sequencing and theory. So probably the earliest that I know of, and I'm horrible because I'm not going to remember the name. It was they started finding these Echelon hand axes in a quarry in France, and at first they were starting to think that okay, it's just damaged by the machines. So this French, he may have been a geologist. They started looking at breaking things to try to make them look at, and all of a sudden they're like, I don't know if it was Sir Jim Evans, not Jim Evans. I'll think of his name in a second, from England, if it all kind of coincided at the same time. But they were seeing that these things couldn't be just accidents of nature. They couldn't be just geofacts. They had to be produced man-made. So they finally started doing that. They started looking at that process. But it still wasn't experimental. The real first, and I mean, I'm probably missing people, and if I am, I apologize, but the first real experimental archaeology that I can really think of, well, I shouldn't say that, General Pitt Rivers did some experimental archaeology in England too, with scapula shovels and things like that. But I mean, when it comes to flint knapping, because stone tools are really in the forefront, everybody's like, stone tools, and it's like, that's what we normally have to freaking make all of our inferences on. Unless you get up to that place where you're in the Bronze Age, and they're still missing a bunch of context, and artifacts as well. But, when you get to a place where we get more preservation and written history, well, that's fine. But we have to really look at that, because the other thing people see, they see somebody flint knap once, and they think that's how everything's done, when we all know that there are many, many ways down the same path, and the debitage may look different, and this, that, and the other. But the ones that I really look at opening the door for modern experimental archaeology was Don Crabtree here in the U.S., and then, of course, Dr. Bordas in France. And they even collaborated. So this is like, 60s, something like that? I think there was lots of little things being done, but it wasn't really being pushed as, I don't think, as a science. So you see Don Crabtree doing something on Folsom fluting. He's making all these preforms. They're normally the same material. He's doing all these things step by step. Same thing with Dr. Bordas, doing the same thing. So now all of a sudden you see them doing this and sequencing it. Still there's some things missing, substitution of materials. Did they heat treat the material versus raw material? All these things. But I mean, that's kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version of experimental archaeology. The thing right now, over in Europe and overseas, I think experimental archaeology is light years ahead of us here in the US. And I say that because over there, experimental archaeology is looked at as science, as long as it's being conducted correctly. Here in the US, it seems like it's accepted if it proves somebody's point for their thesis, dissertation, or whatever they're working on at the moment. And therein lies another problem with most experimental archaeology. We only capture a snapshot in that one experiment. That artifact or that replica still has an entire life cycle of its biography. So sometimes people will go all the way to the last stage, but they skip all the stuff in the middle, when that stuff in the middle is really what's causing that artifact to be the way it is. So, when you look at it from that standpoint, if it's done in a scientific manner, if we already admit that there's going to be biases, no matter how much we try. I mean, when I try to do something, I really, really, really try to put myself at that time, place with only the tools and knowledge. Because there's times where, I do European blade core stuff, Scandinavian square section axes, all these different technologies, Lavawa, whatever. But then I sit down and I'm starting to do, let's just say Clovis or Folsom. And I run into a problem. I'm like, well, heck, I can fix that with, wait a minute. We don't have any evidence of these guys doing that particular technology. So if I do that, I've just biased and kind of ruined the whole experiment. So, I mean, I think as long as we're looking at doing it in a very strict manner, I think it's vital for us really for our understanding of what was really going on, as long as we keep in the back of our mind or in the side view that this is still not a concrete answer. In fact, when I write, I will never, ever, 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 ever say this is it, because all it takes is one new excavation, one new thing to show that it was completely wrong, and there's going to be variation even in the archaeological record. But I really do, to think for us to really understand what's going on, the missing majority of the material, we have to do experimentation, and it has to be done right for us to ever see this accepted. I scratch my head. I'm very involved with the organization XARC, as you may know, based out of the Netherlands. And Dr. Percooper and myself numerous times said, what do we have to do to get experimental archaeology more traction in the US? I'm like, I don't know. People use it when it's convenient, and then they're the first ones to throw it away afterwards. And I'm like, wait a minute. Didn't you just base your whole inference on the work that you just did? So why is experimental archaeology? I guess it only works when you do it. I don't know.
Okay, this leads us to another question. Your dissertation was based on Scandinavian archaeology, is it?
Actually, it was based on England, but it was inspired by Scandinavia. I wanted to look at Neolithic flint daggers of the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. But once I got to Exeter and found out that my dissertation needed to be this long, and I knew that what I wanted to do was going to be this long, I kind of said, well, I guess I need to take a section, because all these daggers, flint daggers, kind of appear and disappear at the same time. Yes, a little plus and minus on each side in different places. So I looked at the ones that were found with the bell beaker culture in the UK. So, yeah, it was based on the testing the combative efficacy of Neolithic flint daggers of the bell beaker culture. And what really spurred that on was when you read in all the material, it talks about stone tools are brittle, stone tools will break, stone tools will this, and they could never be used as a weapon. And I'm like, that's not true. I've got a very broad martial arts background as well, a lot of bladed martial arts. I had the flint knapping background, of course, which that's a whole story in itself, because everybody thinks England, they think just tons of flint. Well, there is tons of flint, but it's not all good. And the southern part of England doesn't have good flint. But luckily, I did end up making 2 daggers that fell within the parameters. I took part of the experimental process is I wanted to work with averages as far as dagger size. There's 5 dagger types in the UK. They're all occurring at the same time. One of them actually we could throw out because some Scandinavian daggers did make it over there, not very many. In Scandinavia, you have thousands of daggers being found. In the UK, at the last count and catalog, there was just over 400. So comparatively, there's not that many. But, they just always kept putting on the fact that they're ritual objects or they couldn't be used. Well, the first thing that I say in my dissertation or even on the presentation for the XARC conference was they were never ever designed to be combative weapons. Never. I mean, because you have 3 ranges of combat. But this is all good because these things all had to be considered while doing this. What would be my range of combat if I'm using a very short weapon? It's close. Okay, does it start at a close range? If I've got a dagger, I've got to be within arm's reach of stabbing somebody. There's no way around that. So, okay, there's 3 ranges of combat. There's a long, middle, and a close range. So now we're just talking about that one range. Okay, what other weapons do we see that could have been used? Of course, clubs. Clubs could be used. We see they were kind of gone by then, but shaft-hole battle axes, big stone axes with that weren't so much axes as they were like weapons, other little things like that. So if you had to use your dagger, what would it be? It would be like a last minute thing, or you got that flight or flight moment, and it's like I'm standing my ground, I've got to defend myself. What do I have left? Oh, I've got this. So could that be effective? So now we have to start looking at other things. So we've got the dagger sorted. I had to use Danish material to make the daggers instead of British material. They're very similar in a lot of ways, although Danish material is really, 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 really good flint. And I'm not biased, and it's not my favorite. But anyway, so after we get that out of the way, so what are some of the other variables? If you're stabbing somebody, and I know people are like, God, why does this guy know this kind of stuff? But if you're stabbing somebody, what can slow down the penetration of a blade? Well, number 1, clothing. Yes, a shirt can slow down the penetration of a blade because a blade has to penetrate the shirt before penetrating the flesh. So, what were they wearing? Okay, they could have been going bare-chested, all Braveheart, or they could have been wearing wool because they were raising sheep at that time, and we have fabric from that time, and also like flax or linen. So I had one of my classmates, her big thing was textiles. So I had her make a tunic, because the way I was going to test these, what I really wanted to test them on, it was just going to be an ethical nightmare for the university. For me, with the university, I wanted to use a hog carcass. So, but I was like, no, so what's the next best thing? So now, how do I test this? How do I test this, and what am I going to test it on? So the most lethal way a dagger, or even a modern one, can be used is for thrusting or slashing, especially the thrust. So these are my two things I'm going to test: the slashing ability of a flint dagger, the thrusting ability of a flint dagger, with protection of two types, wool and linen, and without. And then, of course, take a bunch of averages. So I'm like, how do I test this and get past the whole ethical considerations? So then I started thinking about ballistics gel. So now here we start a whole lot of research in ballistics gel, because there's different types of ballistics gel. Okay, I've got that sorted out. Now where do I get it? Luckily, there was a company in the UK that does ballistics gel, and they made ballistics gel torsos. I went with a military, what the military standard is, which is like a 20% mix, which means it's denser. They had also, this company, and I think I might have been one of the first people to use it, they had developed a film that simulated the outer skin layer. So, and luckily because I was retired, they gave me a big discount on it, because the dang thing was very expensive. But it's all for science. So henceforth, why I sponsor scholarships and stuff now, because I know how expensive it can be. But so I get this thing, and I have all my stuff set up. I have how I'm going to test this. Each slash is going to be recorded. How am I going to record this? Each thrust is going to be recorded. How do I record it? Pictures, all these different things had to be brought together. So then I actually had two very, very competent helpers with me. Charlie Mansfield, and who's from the UK, and Sarah Schultz from Wisconsin. And they helped me record all this, because I actually conducted all the testing, because I've got the martial arts background, a lot of bladed martial arts. So I did everything very, very specific. I had a place that I stood. I could take one step when I was doing whatever I was doing. We tried to record a lot of it, and then we recorded everything on spreadsheets that I'd made, length, depth, all these different things. So you had one on the bare torso, and each time I'd make a cut, I'd take a black Sharpie, and I'd color it so I knew that we've already recorded that. Because that was another thing. How do I tell which one? How do I make sure? Luckily, because of my training, my targeting's good, so I could make sure that I didn't cut the same place, which that tunic was pretty darn ripped up by the time everything was said and done. So it got challenging where to use it. So I got all that done, and just as kind of a blind test, I said, hey, I know you guys all want to stab this thing, and they're all like, even Dr. Hercom was like, oh yeah, I want to do this. This is fun. But of course, one of the funniest things about that is when she saw me hit that thing the first time with a flint dagger, her face kind of went blank, and she's like, my God, that's so violent. I said, but that's it. This is interpersonal violence. I'm not going to just walk up and go, poke. I'm going to attack this thing. So this torso weighed probably about 25, 30 kilos. When I was hitting it, I was lifting it up off the table. So I'm hitting it like I'm attacking somebody. So then I had the girls, I'll call them the girls, I had them all do it. Charlie actually had a martial arts background, but in judo. So I turned the torso around, because the density of the gel was the same, but it was fresh. I wanted them to stab it, so I had each one of them stab it. The slash I wasn't so concerned with. Slashes, as if you go through my dissertation and you look at all the tables, they're very superficial. Even my grandmaster I studied, the last Filipino system that I was in, he talks about in the Philippines, he said, you see people get cut all the time, getting slashed. He said, they walk away. He said, the person that you see getting thrusted, they don't usually walk away. And just watch a prison movie. They don't cut each other, they stab each other. So I wanted to see what they did. So the girls all did it. recorded everything. Well, during this time, I'm also talking with medical doctors, surgeons, some of my military doctor friends to kind of get some averages. Okay, if I'm going to attack with a flint dagger, where am I going to stab? I'm not going to probably stab the head. That's a very low value target. Maybe slashing at it, because when you slash, you're trying to make distance. You're trying to keep somebody, no one's going to walk in front of a slashing thing. So you're trying to make distance. So slashes, yeah, superficial. Even slashes to the neck, to the jugular, you have to get to a certain depth. And that was one of the things I talked to him about. Okay, what is internal, external jugular, the subclavian artery, the femoral, things like that? What are the average depths? And I found that the average depth was, 5 centimeters, 3 centimeters, something like that. It averaged about 3-4 centimeters, I believe is what it was. So then I start going through and I put all this stuff in spreadsheets. Well, I was getting at times almost 9 centimeters of penetration out of these daggers. And these daggers, compared to Scandinavian daggers, aren't really made for stabbing. But even the girls, when they did it, they had stabs going beyond 3 centimeters. So I'm like, okay, to me, this tells me, it's not the be all end all, but it says this could work as a weapon if pressed into service to be used as a weapon. But to me, even with all of this, all of that work just answered one question. Can flint work as a flint dagger work as a weapon? Yes, it can. People often talk about, well, they'll probably break. So, if your dagger breaks and you save your life, isn't that worth it? I think that's pretty fair exchange. I can nap a new dagger, or trade something for another dagger, but, I can't make a new life. So yeah, I guess the long and the short of it is, it really, it's a compilation of a bunch of different things. There wasn't just flint napping involved or just experimental archaeology. There was forensic science, there was medical science, there was ballistics research, for the clothing and all this. Because as you know, when you write something up like this, I can't just say, well, clothing will slow down a bullet. So clothing will slow down. We have to be able to show all that. So going and, pulling all this together so that it coalesces into something that people will find ways to poke holes in anything. But you want to make that as tight as you can so that they can't really push through it. So they have to say, well, in this incident, mainly with somebody who is trained to do this kind of stuff, it does seem to work. But I even say that's just the start of this, because all that did was create more questions.
Yeah, that's what I would ask. Like, which questions you raised? What do you think people should pursue in the future based on your work? Like, this would be interesting too.
Well, I think that there's more testing that needs to be done on different dagger types from around Europe. So like the Scandinavian daggers, there's 6 different types. The earliest types are very lancelet. And I told somebody, I've actually made a bet. I would bet a case of beer just about. I think that I can stick in a pig carcass. I think I can stick one from one side to the other. I really do. They're that well designed, and they're designed to penetrate. Also, during my research, I did find skeletal remains are almost never found in graves in Scandinavia because of the acidity of the soil and stuff. But there was one grave found where there was 2 daggers behind the person. There's this much of the tip of one where the midsection would be. So I think he probably took it with him to the grave. But again, it still needs to be looked at. How quickly do they break? I talked to a young man, and I think he's in the Czech Republic doing experimental archaeology. He made a couple daggers, and I don't know how he tested them, but he broke every one of them. And I'm like, I don't know what you're doing, but or how you're testing them. But that's the other thing. That's where the bias really comes in. And luckily, I had those people there that I could say, okay, these are untrained people. I would like to see more of that happen. I'd like to see. I mean, some instruction would have to be done, of course. Safety wise, I wore a Kevlar glove to protect my hand. Most of those things would have had some kind of wrapping or handle. And that was a question: why didn't you put wrapping or handle? And I said, because honestly, I wasn't testing how the dagger functioned as far as that goes. But so more dagger testing as far as involving the other ones. You have the Scandinavian daggers, you have the globular amphoria, and I think catacomb culture over towards Ukraine and Poland. South in Italy, they have their own. Of course, in France, you've got the lever de Bure. They're making big daggers out of that stuff. Yes, a lot of this stuff is multifunctional. A lot of these things were prestige, but they were also weapons. I mean, even on the big fancy prestige daggers in Scandinavia, we see resharpening on them. You don't resharpen something if you're not using it.
Sure.
Most likely, and I hate that the words ceremonial and ritual have been so bastardized as they have, because we truly do have ceremony and ritual, and I think that that's what some of this stuff was made for. But I think they were also symbols of power. At that time in Europe, in Scandinavia, you had the emergence of true societal groups. And then you start getting a hierarchy in that society. So I think some things like shaft hole battle axes were probably one of the first marks of a military, like a membership to that group within that society. So daggers kind of do the same thing. So there's so many things. There's so many different avenues you can go. Edge, test them over a period of time, and then look at edge wear, micro wear. Yeah. Are they being used to cut? Because that's the other thing that gets me a lot too. Is people are like, well, these were just daggers. No, if you needed to cut something, they cut. Well, these things were just this. No, I think things were used opportunistically as well. Is your flint dagger? This thing is made to be used. Okay, can it be a weapon? Sure it can. So can your kitchen knife. But what's its kitchen knife's primary purpose to what? Cut things. Well, that's what this is for, cut things. But can it be used for other things? Yes. Much to my chagrin, like with my dad growing up, yes, metal knives can be pry bars and scrapers. And I'm like, oh God, no. So, they were used for whatever. So those types of things, I think, need to be looked at when you look at, okay, now we can just look at microwear or usewear. A lot more in-depth studies looking at true penetration on real targets like a hog with its organs and things in. All of those things, hafting of them, then go back and look at the residue, make a bunch of hafted ones, use them in every way conceivable for cutting, for stabbing, for whatever, and then see if we find some of that. And I think there's a list. It's been so long since I looked at my dissertation that, I did have a list of future experiments, because everything I'm working on, well, I've pretty much wrapped one up right now. I just need to edit. And I don't have a deadline, so that's what's killing me. I'm really good if I have a deadline. If I don't, I'm not so good. But I've got it written, and it's on indigenous creation of metal points here, historically on the plains. And the same thing with that. I've made about 100 of these points, which were all cold chiseled out of barrel hoops and things like that. But same thing. I'm trying to just show the process, but during that process, more questions arise. Sure. But like I tell that when I get a chance to talk to like undergraduates, especially when it comes into academia, I say don't chase the rabbit. If you're focused on, if your question is, can a flint dagger be used as a combative weapon? Then stick to that. Yeah. Because it's real easy to go, and it's like, then the next thing you know, you've got an 8,000 page paper, which can't be, and you still haven't answered the first question that
I think your work is really, really important to show, especially students, the necessity of interdisciplinarity in archaeology. How important it is to talk to a lot of people, to read a lot of stuff outside of archaeology. In your specific case, your background was really important because you have martial arts, blade background, so you knew how to do the proper blows and stuff like this. So it's really nice for the students to understand that archaeology is absolutely interdisciplinary. And
I mean, really, really so, to the fact where I would say that, we can't know everything. Even like in lithics, I've got a pretty broad base, but I don't know everything. I mean, there better be stuff that I'm still learning. I mean, I better be learning every day still. But don't be afraid to not be the expert. And even bigger, don't be afraid to fail. Failure in itself, if you do everything correctly, is still an answer. But you can't know everything. It's like if I were to write something, I understand ceramics, I understand prehistoric tanning technologies, but I've got friends that's their whole thing. So why would I consider myself an expert and try to answer those when I can say, hey, Dr. Camper or Dr. Emmerich or hey, Sarah or whoever, and say, can you interject here? And because it costs me absolutely nothing to cite somebody and use them as a reference and use their knowledge base. And that's the one thing that I'd really like to see, because as much as maybe it's gotten a little better, there's this hoarding of knowledge in archaeology that is really detrimental to our vocation. If we are truly looking at understanding our ancestral past, then we need to be sharing all of our information so we're not all repeating the same stuff. But yeah, I mean, back to the same thing. Yes, find experts. If any of your students need me, I'm here. I charge nothing. I mean, I'd be more than happy to help anybody, because I think one of the questions or one of the things you asked too was, how much did my prior background really help me with being able to conduct my experiment?
Yeah.
I probably, if I didn't have my background, I could probably still do it, but I don't think the results would have been as solidified. I don't think I would probably get skewed information. I mean, just as an example, the girls, when they stabbed, yes, they got up to, one of them I think got just over 4 centimeters or close to 4 centimeters. Ballistics gel is super dense. That's actually, that's a pretty good stab. But I don't think if I didn't have the proper knowledge how to do it, I don't think I would have been able to get such a good pie or a good pool of results to be able to compact together, because maybe if I wasn't using it right. And then the other thing we got to put into the factor, if somebody's using that, you also have that huge dump of adrenaline during a fight as well. So that's going to be literally driving things different too. So I think, honestly, everything that I've done up to that point put me exactly where I needed to be to conduct that experiment, with outside help, of course. I'm not a doctor. I mean, I can read, but the funny thing is, I had a hard time finding out. I thought it would be pretty much an average. To get to this internal jugular is approximately blah, blah, blah. Nowhere. I couldn't find any of that. So finally I just reached out to some anesthetists and things. I'm like, these guys got to know where veins are, And then again, just taking averages. This person says this person says that. Looking at averages of daggers. I documented one down by Exeter that was this big. It had been resharpened down to nothing. But I had to do averages. So I took Dr. Catherine Freeman. She's in Australia, but she's from the UK. She actually, for her thesis or dissertation, she actually did a catalog of all the flint bell beaker daggers in the UK. So it was like, dang, this helps. So then I'm just taking averages of the types of daggers that I'm looking at. And then I went out and I tried to find all the ones that I could access and look at, especially ones that hadn't been reported or recorded. And then did that. And But I made all these little cardboard templates of sizes and shapes and thicknesses and what is my maximum thickness I can have? What is my this? What is that? Because you want it, yeah, there's a variety, but you want it to fall somewhere in a happy medium of everything, you know? So I think all of that stuff came into play and kind of coalesced into what it was. I mean, are there things I would do different? Probably, but not really that much. I don't think I'd change much. If I had more time, maybe I would have done things a little different. But then again, thinking of the constraints of academia, sure. I've only got, you know. Yeah. But that's where that last part of your paper always says future experimentation. You know?
Yeah. And of course, like we tend to do some research using our background. But if the person doesn't have the background, that's very important. As you said, like, let's say somebody wants to make an experiment like you made and doesn't have any background in martial arts or pointed stuff. These people should ask experts to do the actual stabbing. No?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because I think what happens is the person will get results. And if you can have more than one type of person, have a group that's nothing but people who've never done it before. Have a group that have been trained, and then you can compare those two together and say, wait a minute, with just very little instruction or no instruction, these guys weren't stabbing, much less than the person who was at. So these things kind of open up a bunch of things. But I mean, we can't be experts on everything. We can't. There's just no physical possible way. I mean, my love for this stuff goes all the way to the Viking Age. You know, I can forge, I can make things like this, but not as good as some of my friends can.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have the expertise that a lot of them do. So what would I do? I would not be doing an experiment or doing the experiment justice by using my limited knowledge to try to explain something that somebody who's made 100 or 200 or 300, you know, swords has done. There's so much to be said for that, and that's why with that experimental archaeology award that I sponsor through XArt, it's open to everybody, because I know a lot of people that have 0 degrees that do things like this because they really enjoy them, that have more knowledge than anybody will ever have because they do it all the time. So, and those people are usually 99.9% of the time ready, willing, and eager to help anybody with their work, just for a simple thank you and maybe the acknowledgement in their paper. You know, but then you get a better, because remember, we're talking about science here. We're talking about removing biases and variables. A lack of understanding or a lack of true development of a skill to do something is a variable. So how do you minimize that variable? You reach out to somebody who knows more than you. Don't be afraid to say, and this is what I tell the student, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Can somebody help? Sure. Because usually there's somebody there to help.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a great message. And this is the beauty of the thing, you know, this beauty of the scientific endeavor, you know, that you need other people. You need other people, and beyond the limits of your own academic niche, you know. And,
absolutely.
And especially in the humanities, this is really hard to do. People are really inside the limits of the discipline. And again, I think archaeology has this very nice story of interdisciplinary work, because archaeology really needs, it's not a choice. It's not because we want to be interdisciplinary. We need to be. There is no other
absolutely
way.
I mean, look at, then you have all your soils and all these other things that come together, because again, we want as complete a picture as we can ever see. So how do you do that? You bring in people from every walk of life to look at something, and everybody everybody's input. I mean, I try to never dismiss anybody's input for anything, because they may see something that I don't see. Always take what people say, you know. I always try to listen. You know, it's like looking at when you guys so graciously invited me to come down, I knew that I needed to get a better handle on your stone tool industry, which is very interesting. And I mean, I've talked to, I'll butcher his name, Yokon. I can't think. Bruce just went down there, his last trip.
John Carlos.
Yep, that's exactly what I just said. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Well, you know, he started working on that. Hey, look, all this stuff isn't the same. And I mean, when you look at it, some of it morphologically looks the same, but it's not. Okay, that's one separate thing. But one of the things that I saw when Leticia, Dr. Carrillo sent me some of the papers was I saw your points have these little tiny stems on the end.
Yeah.
And when I see that, I'm like, one of the first things I say is, when I see that, I see something getting stuck in something. So then the next thing I do is like, do you guys have river cane or bamboo down there? Then I find out you guys have like 130 species of river cane and bamboo.
Yeah.
So then I'm like, okay, let's see. So I take something like this is a little piece of river cane, and I stick it inside here, but
wow, great.
Guess what? I can put that on here like a foreshaft. I can pull that off. I've got another one. I can pull that off and put this one on.
Wow.
You know, but it's again, it's one of those things. It's having a background in this kind of stuff. I hunted. I don't have the hunting background that a lot of people do, but I bow hunted. I've rifle hunted, and I'm telling you that all of these things add up. I mean, if you've got game that you can walk up and club in the head, you're not going to make a bow or a gun or anything else. But all of these things come together, you know.
Yeah.
So looking at this, why would you have a stemmed point? Well, you're probably putting it in something. Well, what do you have that's hollow? You know, and kind of going through that, kind of the same process again, you know.
And hey, John, thank you very much. And I hope we will be able to show you a lot of stuff here also. The landscape, animals and stuff like this, the archaeological sites. And if you have any final words or final thoughts, and then we can finish.
Well, I guess the only thing I would say, especially to the students and even our colleagues out there, is, you know, stay hungry, continue to learn. Don't be don't be afraid to not be the expert. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And don't be afraid to share. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things I see in archaeology is people, it's like, you know, Lord of the Rings and Gollum. You know, my precious! They got their little information they don't want to share.
Yeah. This is very common. Unfortunately, it's very, very common. Yeah.
And we shouldn't be. We're living in an age where, I mean, look, you're in Brazil, I'm outside of San Antonio, Texas, and we're talking live. This is a time to share. I mean, I consult with a colleague, a dear colleague in Ukraine. We do the same thing, videos. We can do that now. So share. Don't be afraid to fail, I guess would even be a bigger one. If you do everything properly, failure in itself is an answer. Failure tells you that this is not the way they were doing it. So that, and I'm looking very forward to meeting many of you and working with you. And don't be afraid. I don't bite, and I've had all my shots if I do. So,
okay, thank you very much. You are very kind, and I hope to see you soon.
Oh no, thank you, Astolfo, and I look forward to seeing you guys. I'll be in touch.
Great.